The smell of charred beans hit Frances Grady square in the face the moment she stepped through the door of the little ranch house, and she knew right then that this arrangement was going to be far more complicated than she had bargained for. It was the spring of 1878, and the Texas Panhandle was just beginning to shake off the iron grip of winter. The land around Hart Creek was vast and open, stretching in every direction like a rumpled brown blanket tossed over the earth by some careless giant, and the sky above it was the kind of deep blue that made a person feel both small and free at the same time. Frances had arrived on the afternoon stage from Amarillo, carrying a single trunk, a basket of her mother's preserves, and a heart that was doing its absolute level best to stay guarded. She was 24 years old, with dark auburn hair that she kept pinned at the base of her neck, and green eyes that people tended to remember long after they had forgotten everything else about her. She was not a delicate woman, not in the way the magazines from back east described women. She had strong hands, the kind that knew the difference between kneading bread and snapping a chicken's neck, and she had a laugh that came out of her like a surprise, sudden and warm, and a little too loud for polite company. She had grown up on a farm in eastern Tennessee, had lost her father to a fever 2 years back, had watched her mother remarry a perfectly decent man who made Frances feel like a guest in a house that used to be her own, and had answered an advertisement in the Amarillo newspaper placed by a Mr. Simon Sullivan of Hart Creek, who was looking for a housekeeper with cooking experience and the constitution for hard work. The advertisement had not mentioned anything about romance. It had not promised anything beyond fair wages, a private room, and the opportunity to build something in a part of the country that was still raw enough to let a person be whatever they decided to be. Frances had folded the newspaper carefully, slept on the decision for exactly one night, and written her letter of application the next morning. What the advertisement had also not mentioned, she now realized, standing in the doorway of the most chaotic kitchen she had ever seen in her adult life, was that Simon Sullivan had apparently never successfully prepared a single meal in his 28 years on this earth. The cast iron pot on the stove was smoking. The beans inside it had passed beyond the stage of being burned and had entered some darker, more philosophical territory, crusted black and welded to the bottom of the pot with the dedication of something that had decided it belonged there permanently. There were 2 tin cups on the small wooden table, both of them ringed with coffee stains that suggested the man brewed his coffee with approximately the same care a person might use when dunking a boot in a creek. A skillet on the hearth contained the flattened, blackened remains of what might once have been biscuits, though at this point they resembled something more geological than culinary. A sack of flour had been opened, and then it appeared, abandoned, leaving a pale drift of white across the floorboards near the window. Frances stood and looked at all of this for a long, measured moment. Then she heard boots on the porch, and Simon Sullivan came through the back door. He was tall, broader in the shoulder than the doorframe quite comfortably allowed, with dark hair that was somewhat longer than fashion strictly approved of, and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in at least 4 days. He had the sun-dark skin of a man who spent his days outside, and his eyes were the gray of a coming rainstorm, the kind that is equal parts beautiful and dangerous. He was wearing a faded blue work shirt, dusty canvas trousers, and boots that had seen hard miles and made no apology for it. He stopped when he saw her, and for a moment they simply looked at one another across the ruinous kitchen. "Miss Grady," he said, and his voice was low and careful, the voice of a man who chose his words deliberately. "I wasn't expecting you until tomorrow." "The stage was a day early," Frances said. She gestured with admirable restraint toward the smoking pot. "Your beans are on fire." He glanced at the pot. Something crossed his face that she could not quite read, something that might have been embarrassment if he had been the kind of man who wore embarrassment openly, but he was not quite that kind of man. Instead, he moved to the stove with unhurried steps, picked up the pot using the thick fold of his bandana, and set it on the stone hearth. "I was attempting supper," he said. "I can see that," Frances said. "I wasn't having great success." "No," she agreed, and because she was not a woman who believed in softening the truth when the truth was already perfectly clear, she left it at that. He looked at her then with those storm-gray eyes, and she had the feeling that he was measuring her the same way she was measuring him, honestly and without particular ceremony. She straightened her spine a little, which was something she did without thinking whenever she felt the need to hold her ground, and met his gaze directly. "Your room is the second door on the left," he said. "I'll show you the rest of the property in the morning. Wages are $8 a month, same as I wrote. There's a well out back and a kitchen garden that needs considerable attention." He paused. "I apologize for the state of things." "Which things specifically?" Frances asked. He looked around the kitchen, and this time something shifted in his expression, something that was the beginning of self-aware humor, though it hadn't quite arrived yet. "Most of them," he admitted. "That's honest," she said. "I appreciate honest." She set her basket on the table, untied her bonnet, and hung it on the hook by the door. Then she looked at the ruined pot, the blackened skillet, and the flour-dusted floor, and she rolled up her sleeves. "Have you got bacon?" she asked. "In the larder," he said, sounding slightly startled, as though he had not expected her to simply begin. "And eggs?" "Yes." "Then go wash up," she said. "I'll have something edible on the table in 20 minutes, and then you can tell me what exactly you've been eating for the past however long you've been living alone out here." He hesitated for a moment in the doorway, and she thought he was going to say something, some protest or some explanation of why he hadn't simply hired someone sooner or managed better on his own. But he didn't. He just gave a single nod, the kind that meant he respected a person who knew their own capabilities, and he went to wash his hands at the basin by the back door. Frances built the fire back up properly, found the bacon and the eggs, located a passably clean skillet, and had a real supper on the table in 18 minutes. She found a jar of her mother's apple preserves in her basket and set it out because it seemed like the kind of place where something sweet was overdue. Simon Sullivan sat across from her and ate with the focused gratitude of a man who had not had a decent meal in a very long time. He did not wolf his food down or ignore manners entirely, but he ate steadily and completely, and when he finished, he looked at the empty plate for a moment with an expression that was almost reverent. "That's the best meal I've had since November," he said. "What happened in November?" Frances asked. "My neighbor's wife, Mrs. Calloway, took pity on me and sent over a pot of stew." He set his fork down. "Before that it was August, when I was in Amarillo for supplies and ate at the hotel." Frances stared at him. "You've been feeding yourself since August on your own cooking." "I've been surviving," he said, which she realized was not exactly the same thing. "How?" she asked, genuinely curious. "Salt pork," he said, "jerky, hardtack when I remembered to make it, though I have not yet perfected the process." He considered. "Coffee, a considerable amount of coffee." "Coffee is not a meal," Frances said. "I'm aware of that," he said, and this time the ghost of that almost humor was back in his eyes. "I'm also aware that I am not a man suited to domestic tasks. I'm good with horses. I'm good with cattle. I can fix a fence line in the dark. I can track an animal across hard ground for 3 days. I cannot make a biscuit that doesn't end up harder than the pan it's cooked in." He said all of this matter-of-factly, without shame, which she found she respected more than if he had been apologetic about it. A man who knew his limitations was, in her experience, considerably more useful than a man who pretended he had none. "Well," she said, "that's what you hired me for." "Yes," he said, "it is." They looked at each other across the table, and the lamp between them threw warm light across his face and across hers, and the evening settled around the ranch house like something that intended to stay. Frances woke the next morning before dawn, which was her habit, and found that Simon was already gone from the house. His coffee cup was on the table, and the coffee inside it was barely touched, which suggested he had made it himself, and found it undrinkable even by his own standards, which was saying something. She emptied it, made a fresh pot, and drank a cup standing at the kitchen window, watching the sun come up over the flat Texas horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and rose that were almost too extravagant to be real. She spent the morning assessing the house. It was a solid structure, built with the practical no-nonsense quality of a man who cared more about function than appearance. 3 rooms downstairs, 2 upstairs, a good stone hearth, a proper iron stove that worked well once she'd cleaned the flue, and a larder that was stocked with the basics but nothing more. The kitchen garden was indeed in a state of considerable neglect, but the soil was good, and the well water was clean and cold, and she could see that with some work it would produce well through the summer. She was on her knees in the garden, pulling the winter's dead growth away from the emerging green shoots of something that might be wild onion, when she heard the horses come into the yard and stood up to see Simon riding in with 2 other men, both of them ranch hands, she guessed, from the look of them. The younger one was a boy of perhaps 19 named. She would learn Deke Hastings, with a cheerful freckled face and a genuinely bottomless appetite. The older one was a weathered Mexican cowhand named Ernesto Vega, who had ridden with Simon since before Simon had bought the ranch, and who had a quiet dignity about him and the kind of steadiness that comes from having seen enough of the world to know what matters. Both of them treated her with courtesy, and Ernesto removed his hat when he spoke to her, which she thought was a fine habit. "We weren't sure you'd actually come," Deke said to her, with the bluntness of youth. "Simon's been trying to find a housekeeper for 6 months. Most of them left after a week." "Deke," Simon said, in a tone that was not quite a warning but was in that general neighborhood, "why did they leave?" Frances asked, keeping her eyes on Deke with the expression she used when she wanted a straight answer. Deke glanced at Simon. Simon looked at the middle distance with studied neutrality. "The cooking disasters," Deke said, deciding apparently that honesty was the better path. "He tried to cook for them their first night here, to be welcoming, and the first woman said the kitchen smelled like a fire had taken a personal interest in the place, and she left the next morning. The second one, he singed her good apron trying to demonstrate that he'd figured out how to make cornbread, and she was on the next stage to Amarillo." "I see," Frances said. She looked at Simon. He was looking at a fence post with the intensity of a man who found fence posts enormously interesting. "To be clear," she said, "I am the housekeeper. The cooking is mine to handle. You are not to go near the stove unsupervised." Ernesto made a sound that was carefully not a laugh. "That seems wise," Simon said, still looking at the fence post. She went back to her garden, and she could feel his gaze on her back as she knelt in the dirt again, and she told herself firmly that the warm feeling that produced was simply the spring sunshine. The first month passed in the comfortable rhythm of useful work, which was Frances's favorite kind of existence. She turned the kitchen into a proper operation. She baked bread twice a week, made biscuits that rose the way biscuits were supposed to rise, grew herbs along the kitchen window sill, traded preserves with Mrs. Calloway down the road for cream, and generally transformed the house from the cheerless, smoke-stained bachelor's quarters it had been into something that smelled of yeast and coffee and clean floors. Simon stayed largely out of her way in the house, which she had expected, but what she hadn't expected was the way he filled the rest of the space. He was everywhere on the property, moving with the contained efficiency of a man who had been doing physical labor his entire life, always working, always purposeful, and yet he had a quality of stillness about him when he was at rest that she found herself noticing in quiet moments. He was not a great talker, but he was a good listener, and on the evenings when they sat at the supper table together after Deke and Ernesto had gone to the bunkhouse, he had the useful habit of asking questions that were actually interesting. He asked her about Tennessee. He asked her what she thought of Texas. He asked her whether she had always known how to cook or whether someone had taught her, and she told him about her grandmother, who had raised her in the kitchen the way other grandmothers might raise children in a garden, carefully and with great patience, and with the understanding that this knowledge was itself a kind of inheritance. He told her about his own history in pieces, the way cautious people share things, a little at a time, testing the ground. He had grown up in Missouri. His father had been a farmer who worked himself to death on land that never yielded enough, and Simon had decided at 17 that he would not do the same, that he would find land that was worth the work. He had come west at 19, hired on as a trail hand, saved his money for 7 years and bought the Hart Creek property 4 years ago when he was 24. He had no family left to speak of, no mother since he was 15, no father since 21, and no siblings who had lived past infancy. He had built everything he had from the ground up with his own hands, and it showed in both the ranch and the man. "You never married?" Frances asked one evening, and then immediately regretted the question because it was too direct, too personal for the territory they had thus far carefully stayed within. But Simon didn't seem to mind. He turned his coffee cup in his hands and thought about it the way he thought about everything without rushing. "No," he said, "I thought about it once. There was a woman in Abilene when I was on the trail drives, but she wanted to go back east and I wanted to go further west, and those two desires don't have much common ground between them." "Did it hurt?" Frances asked, and she didn't know exactly why she was pursuing this line, but she seemed unable to stop. "For a while," he said simply. "Things do." He looked at her then, and she looked back, and the lamp threw its warm light between them again, and she became aware that the conversation had moved into territory that neither of them had exactly planned for. She stood up and began clearing the dishes, and he helped her without being asked, which was something she hadn't expected from a man living alone, and she noted it in the part of her that kept careful accounts of things that mattered. The incident that changed the course of things happened on a Saturday in late May, during the kind of afternoon that the Texas Panhandle specializes in producing, hot and dry and still, with a wind that carries dust and the smell of sage and the distant sound of cattle. Frances had ridden into Hart Creek in the morning with Ernesto to sell eggs and pick up supplies, and Simon had stayed on the property to work on the north fence line. She came back to find the kitchen in the early stages of what appeared to be another catastrophe. Simon was standing at the stove with the expression of a man who has been outsmarted by an inanimate object. There was smoke rising from the iron skillet. There was what appeared to be a battered and suffering attempt at cornbread in a pan on the counter, pale and sad and clearly never going to rise. There was a pot of something on the back burner that was making a sound like it was contemplating revolt. He turned when she came in, and his expression was a remarkable combination of dignity and defeat. "Deke's birthday is today," he said. "I thought I might do something." Frances set down her basket and looked at the disaster area. Then she looked at Simon, who was holding a wooden spoon like it had personally offended him, and she felt something crack open inside her chest, some carefully maintained structure of professional distance, because the sight of this capable, serious, physically formidable man being completely undone by a skillet of cornbread was the most endearing thing she had ever seen in her life. She laughed. Not a polite little laugh, not a socially managed chuckle. A real laugh from the belly, the kind that comes out unexpectedly and doesn't apologize for itself. She laughed until she had to put her hand on the counter for support, and she saw his expression shift from surprise to uncertain to something that was unmistakably warm as he watched her. And then slowly, helplessly, he began to laugh too, a low, quiet rumble of a laugh that sounded like it was finding its way out of a man who didn't use it often enough. "The cornbread," she managed, gesturing at the pale, forlorn pan. "I know," he said. "What happened to it?" "I don't know," he said. "I followed the proportions." "Did you add the baking powder?" A pause. "There's baking powder in cornbread." She laughed again, helplessly, and he shook his head slowly, and the laugh was still in his eyes even though his face had composed itself, and she knew in that moment, with the sudden clarity of something that had been true for a while and had simply waited for the right moment to announce itself, that she was in considerable trouble. "All right," she said, coming around to the stove and gently taking the wooden spoon from his hand. "Stand back and watch, because I'm not doing this twice." He didn't stand back. He stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and watched everything she did with the focused attention he gave to everything he considered worth learning. She showed him how to test the heat of the skillet, how to mix the cornbread so it came out tender instead of dense, how to tell when the biscuits were done by the smell as much as the color. She talked him through the pot on the back burner, which turned out to be her own beans that she had left to soak and which he had, with the best of intentions, put on the fire to help, a gesture that had gone sideways when he'd turned the heat up too high. "The beans need patience," she said. "Low heat, long time." "That's true of most things worth having," he said quietly, and she glanced up at him and found he was looking at her, not at the pot, and the moments stretched between them like warm taffy until she looked away and focused on the cornbread. Deke's birthday supper was the best meal the ranch house had seen, and Deke ate himself into a cheerful stupor and declared Frances a miracle, which made Ernesto smile and made Simon look at his plate with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the expression of a man trying to keep his thoughts from appearing on his face and not entirely succeeding. After supper, when Deke and Ernesto had gone to the bunkhouse with the remains of the birthday cake Frances had made that afternoon using the last of her good vanilla, Simon helped her wash up without being asked, as he always did, and they worked side by side in the warm kitchen in the comfortable quiet that had become theirs over these weeks. "Thank you," he said, when the last dish was done and she was drying her hands. "For the cooking. That's my job," she said. "Not for that." He set the last pot on its hook and turned to face her. "For laughing." She looked at him, uncertain what he meant. "I know the kitchen was a mess," he said. "Most people would have been irritated or pitying. You laughed like it was the funniest thing you'd ever seen, and you went right ahead and fixed it, and that was a kind thing." She felt her chest do something complicated. "It was funny," she said, keeping her voice even. "Yes," he said, "but you made it feel like it was something else as well." She didn't ask what else. She didn't think either of them was quite ready for that answer yet. She said goodnight and went upstairs to her room, and she lay in her bed listening to the Texas night and thinking about a man who couldn't cook a thing in the world but who tried anyway, out of wanting to do something for a boy's birthday. And she thought that there were worse things to find in a person than honest effort and the grace to laugh at themselves. June came in hot and golden, and with it came the first real crisis of the summer. A band of cattle rustlers had been working the county for 2 months, and 3 of Simon's best steers went missing from the south pasture on a Tuesday night. He spent 3 days tracking with Ernesto, and came back having recovered 2 of the 3 animals, and with a look on his face that told Frances the third was not coming back. She had supper waiting, kept warm on the back of the stove, and she did not make a fuss about the late hour or the dried mud on his boots or the cut along his left forearm that he was pretending wasn't there. She made him sit down and she cleaned and wrapped the cut while he ate, and he let her do it without argument, which she understood was its own kind of trust. "How bad was it?" she asked, winding the bandage. "Nothing that couldn't be managed," he said. "The sheriff in Pantano's dealing with the main group. Most of them have moved on. And the arm? Fence wire," he said. She tied off the bandage and sat back, and he looked at his wrapped arm and then at her, and there was something in his eyes that she had been noticing more and more frequently, something that was not quite settled, something that was looking for a place to land. "You didn't have to wait up," he said. "I know I didn't," she said. They sat with that for a moment. "Frances," he said, and then stopped. "What?" She said, because she was a woman who preferred things to be said out loud. He was quiet for a moment more, turning the words over carefully, the way he did. "I think you are the most capable person I have ever met," he said finally, "and I think I am in considerable danger of making a fool of myself over you." The directness of it caught her completely off guard. She had been expecting him to work around to it slowly, if he got there at all, the way careful men sometimes spent so much time being careful that they circled the thing they wanted to say without ever quite arriving. But he said it plainly, looking her in the eyes, and the honesty of it hit her somewhere between the ribs. "Is that so?" she said, keeping her voice steady. "I thought you should know," he said, given that you work here, given that it might make things complicated." "It might," she agreed. "I don't intend to make things uncomfortable," he said. "If you'd rather I didn't say anything else about it, I won't." She looked at him, this serious, quiet, hopelessly domestically incompetent man, with his bandaged arm and his storm-gray eyes and his careful way of saying things that mattered, and she thought about her guarded heart and the careful professional distance she had maintained, and then she thought about the way he had laughed in the kitchen, and the way he had helped her wash dishes without being asked, and the way he had asked her real questions and listened to her answers as though they were important. "You burned your beans," she said. He blinked. "I did," he agreed cautiously, "and your biscuits, and whatever was in that skillet the first night I arrived. That was salt pork," he said, "or had been. You tried to make a birthday supper for a boy who works for you," she said, "because you thought it would mean something to him, and it did." "Frances," he said, and his voice was low and careful, but there was something underneath it that wasn't careful at all. "I am not in the habit of telling men what they want to hear," she said. "So I'll tell you what's true. I came here because I needed a fresh start, and I intended to keep this entirely professional. And I have been failing at that intention since approximately the first week." Something changed in his face. The careful, composed exterior didn't disappear exactly, but it became transparent, and what was underneath it was something that was both certain and vulnerable at the same time, which she thought was the most honest thing a person could show another person. "Is that so?" he said, turning her own words back at her with the smallest possible hint of a smile. "It is," she said firmly. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, large and calloused and warm, and she looked down at their joined hands and then back up at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment because there wasn't anything to add. After that evening, things between them shifted in the way that things shift when two people have finally told the truth, and the truth turns out to be the same truth for both of them. It was not sudden or dramatic. It happened the way most of the best things happen, gradually, in the dailiness of shared life. He began to seek her company in the evenings rather than retiring immediately to go over his account books or check on the horses. She began to save interesting things to tell him, small observations from her day that she found herself turning over during the afternoon, thinking she would tell Simon this at supper. He still could not cook. This remained a fixed and immutable fact of his existence. On a Sunday morning when she had a bad head cold and he insisted she stay in bed, he attempted to make her breakfast and came upstairs 45 minutes later with a tray containing coffee that was actually good this time, and scrambled eggs that were brown at the edges but technically edible, and a piece of toast that had been burned on one side and left raw on the other. She looked at the tray and looked at him, and he looked at her with that expression she was coming to love, the one that acknowledged the situation with complete self-awareness but held its ground anyway. "I tried to be careful with the eggs," he said. "I can see that," she said. "The toast got away from me. They often do. I could try again," he offered. "Come sit down," she said, making room on the edge of the bed. "I'll eat what's here and be grateful for it." He sat on the edge of the bed and watched her eat the imperfect eggs and the one-sided toast with the earnest attention of a man who wanted very much to have done better, and she found that she meant what she'd said entirely. The effort was the thing. The effort was, in fact, the whole thing. "Simon," she said, when she had drunk the coffee, which was genuinely good, "when I was a girl, my father could not boil water without assistance. My mother used to say that it was one of the things she loved most about him because it meant he always needed her in the kitchen, which was where she was happiest." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not saying that's all it is," she said. "I'm saying that a person doesn't have to be able to do everything to be worth everything." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I intend to learn eventually. I don't like being useless." "You are not useless," she said, with sufficient emphasis that he heard it. "You are a man who built a ranch from nothing, who takes care of the people who work for him, who tried to make a birthday supper and made a catastrophe of it and let me laugh at it without getting his pride in the way. That is not useless." He took the tray from her lap and set it on the floor, and then he took her hand again, and they sat like that in the morning light filtering through the curtains, and he said quietly, "I'd like to court you properly, Frances, if you'll let me. Not as your employer. As a man who thinks you are extraordinary and would very much like the opportunity to say so more often." She looked at his face, the honest steadiness of it, and she thought about what the word properly meant in a place like Hart Creek in the year 1878, where there was no great society to observe them and no elaborate ritual to follow, just two people on a working ranch in the middle of a wide Texas landscape who had found something in each other that neither of them had been looking for. "I'll let you," she said. He smiled then, a full, real smile that she had not seen before in all its complete form, and it changed his whole face, the way sunlight changes a landscape, revealing things that the shadow had kept hidden. And Frances Grady understood in that moment that she was entirely and irrevocably done for. Summer moved forward with the full determination of a Texas summer, which is to say with a heat that sits on the land like something with intent, and a sky that burns blue from horizon to horizon, without a cloud in it for days at a time. The ranch work was relentless in the season, and Simon was up before light and often not back until the shadows were long, but the evenings were theirs, and they made the most of them. He took her riding on Sunday afternoons, which he had apparently decided constituted proper courting in the circumstances, and she had no objection because she loved horses and the Texas land was something you needed to experience from horseback to fully understand. He knew the land with an intimacy that could only come from years of daily attention, knew where the creeks ran underground and came up in unexpected places, knew which draws held water through the drought, and which grasses meant the soil beneath was deep and good. He talked more now. Not a great deal more, because he was not a man who was ever going to be verbose, but more than before, opening up in the way people do when they feel safe enough to let themselves be known. He told her about the trail drives, about the months of riding through country that had not yet been much touched by settlement, about the particular quality of silence that exists on the open range at night when you are far from any town. He told her about a winter he had spent in a line camp in Colorado, 3 months of snow and solitude, and how it had taught him both his own limitations and his own resources. She told him things she had not told anyone in a long time. She told him about her father's death, not just the fact of it but the shape of it, the way the absence of him had changed the geometry of everything she had known. She told him about the loneliness of the months before she had come to Texas, the feeling of being in the wrong place in the life that should have been hers. She told him about the night she had read his advertisement in the newspaper and felt something shift, some interior compass needle swinging, and how she had not understood what it was pointing at until considerably later. "What did you think when you read it?" he asked. They were sitting on the porch in the cooling evening, the day's heat releasing itself slowly into the darkening sky. "I thought it sounded like a real place," she said. "Not a pretty description, not a promise of anything glamorous. Just a real place with real work that needed doing." "That's all I could offer," he said. "It was the right thing to offer," she said. "I didn't want to be charmed. I've been charmed before and it hadn't amounted to anything useful." He looked at her and she felt him wanting to ask about that, the previous being charmed, and she appreciated that he didn't, that he let her decide what to share and when. "There was someone in Tennessee," she said, because she found she wanted to tell him anyway. "A man named Chester who had a nice way of talking, and very little else to recommend him. He told me a great many things about what he intended and then did none of them, and when my father died he decided that the farm without the farm's owner wasn't what he'd had in mind, and he found someone else to charm." "I'm sorry," Simon said. "It made me careful," she said, "which is its own kind of useful." "You are very careful," he agreed without judgment. "You're patient," she said. "Most men aren't when they're told to wait." "Most things worth having require waiting," he said. And she remembered he'd said something like this before, in the kitchen, over the bean pot, and she thought that it was a thing he genuinely believed. She reached over and put her hand on his arm, and he covered her hand with his, and they sat in the Texas dark and listened to the night sounds, the distant call of something in the grass, the creak of the windmill, the low sound of cattle in the far pasture, and the silence between them was the best kind of silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. It was Ernesto who said what everyone had apparently been thinking. He said it in his quiet, direct way, one morning in the yard when Frances was carrying water from the well, and Simon had just ridden in from checking the south fence. "You two are going to get around to it eventually," Ernesto said to no one in particular, filling the water trough for the horses. "Would be better sooner than later is all I am saying. The waiting is getting painful to watch." Simon looked at Ernesto with an expression that would have been withering on a man less composed. "Thank you, Ernesto," he said. "I am just saying," Ernesto said, and went back to his work with perfect serenity. Frances, who had heard every word, kept her eyes on her water bucket and kept walking, but she was smiling, and she didn't bother to hide it because the bucket was in front of her face. That evening Simon came and found her in the kitchen garden just before supper, when the light was golden and long, and the air smelled of the herbs she had planted and of the cooling earth. He stood at the edge of the garden looking at her with his hands in his pockets, and she wiped the dirt from her hands on her apron and stood up and looked back at him. "Ernesto isn't wrong," he said. "No," she agreed. He came toward her through the garden rows, careful where he stepped, and stood before her, and she had to tilt her head back slightly to look at him, because he was tall enough that she had always been somewhat aware of the vertical distance between them. "Frances," he said, and his voice was low and serious, the voice he used when he meant something absolutely. "I love you. I have been working up to saying that for 2 months, and I might as well say it plainly, because I think you know it anyway, and I'm tired of both of us pretending otherwise." She looked at him, this man who had burned every meal he'd ever attempted, who had tried to cook for a boy's birthday out of pure generosity of heart, who listened carefully and spoke honestly and worked without complaint, and could find water in a drought-cracked landscape, and could not find his way around a kitchen to save his life, and didn't particularly apologize for any of it. This man who had given her a place to be necessary, who had laughed in a smoky kitchen because she had laughed first, who asked her real questions and took her real answers seriously. "I love you too," she said. "I have for a while." He let out a slow breath, as though he had been holding it for some time, and then he reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face with a gentleness that was at odds with the rough work his hands were built for, and he kissed her, and it was the kind of kiss that doesn't need elaboration, because it says everything there is to say. When they broke apart, he kept his hands on either side of her face and looked at her, and his eyes were the color of a cleared storm, everything washed clean and open and bright. "I'd like you to marry me," he said. "I thought you would get around to that," she said. "Is that a yes?" "Yes," she said. "That is a yes." He smiled the full, real smile again, and she thought she would never get entirely used to it, that it would always do to her what it did now, which was make her feel like something had lit up inside her chest that hadn't been properly lit before. Deke, when he heard, let out a whoop that likely scared the horses. Ernesto shook Simon's hand with quiet satisfaction and kissed Frances's cheek, and said something in Spanish that she didn't entirely understand but which sounded like a blessing, which was what she chose to believe it was. They were married in September, in the small white church in Hart Creek, by the traveling minister who came through the county every 6 weeks and who had, over the course of his career, presided over enough frontier weddings to have refined the ceremony to its essential elements without losing any of its meaning. Frances wore a dress of blue calico that she had made herself over the course of August evenings, because there was no time to send for anything fancier, and she didn't particularly want anything fancier, and she carried a bunch of the wildflowers that grew along the creek at the back of the property, tied with ribbon from Mrs. Calloway's sewing basket. Simon stood up at the front of the church and watched her walk up the aisle with the complete, uncomplicated focus he brought to everything that mattered to him, and she walked toward him with her head up and her eyes on his face, and she thought that this was a good beginning. The minister asked his questions. They gave their answers with full intention, and Simon put a ring on her finger that had been his mother's, a simple silver band that she had entrusted to him before she died, and that he had carried for 13 years in a leather pouch in his saddlebag, waiting, apparently, for the right person to give it to. Frances looked down at it and then up at him, and the thing she felt was not the wild, uncertain excitement of something new, but the deeper, more settled feeling of something arrived at, something that had been moving toward this moment for a long time. Deke cried, which he denied energetically afterward. Ernesto did not cry but was seen to blink several times more than was strictly necessary. They had a small supper at the ranch afterward, put together by Frances with help from Mrs. Calloway, who was a large, warm-hearted woman with flour perpetually on her dress and a talent for pie that Frances genuinely respected. The yard was strung with lanterns that Ernesto had found somewhere, and the evening was warm and still, and people from the county who had ridden over ate and drank and told stories, and the night felt full in the way that good nights do. Later, when the guests had gone and Deke and Ernesto were in the bunkhouse and the yard was quiet and the lanterns were burning low, Simon and Frances stood on the porch together looking out at the dark Texas land. "This is yours now," he said, "as much as mine." "I know," she said, "all of it. The house and the land and the disaster of a kitchen garden when I first got here, and the north fence that needs work every spring, and the cattle and the well. And the man who burns everything he touches," she said. He laughed softly. "And that." She leaned against him, and his arm came around her, solid and sure, and she looked out at the darkness and the stars above it, the Texas sky crowded with more stars than a person ever saw back east, and she felt the deep satisfaction of a woman who has found the exact right place to put down roots. The first year of marriage was not without its tests, because nothing real ever is. There was a bad drought in October that took the creek down to a trickle, and had Simon and Ernesto and Deke hauling water from the secondary well for 3 weeks. There was a dispute with a neighboring rancher named Holly's about the boundary line on the east side of the property that required 3 separate meetings and considerable diplomacy before it was resolved without a lawyer, which Simon considered an achievement. There was a hard winter with a blizzard that kept them snowbound for 5 days, which was, Frances reflected later, not entirely the worst thing that had ever happened to her. Those 5 days taught her more about who Simon Sullivan was than the previous months combined. Cut off from the world, with nothing but time and the snow and each other, he was entirely himself in a way that daily obligations and the presence of the hired hands made slightly less visible. He was funny, in a quiet, dry way that she had glimpsed but not seen fully. He read, from the small but serious collection of books on the shelf in the front room, and he read to her in the evenings by the fire, choosing things he thought she would enjoy and being right about it more often than not. He played cards, and he was good enough at it to make the games interesting without being good enough to be irritating. He taught her to do a rudimentary repair on a saddle which she had never had occasion to learn before, and she taught him to make proper coffee, which he had been doing wrong all his adult life because he used too much heat and not enough patience. "Like everything else," she said, as he watched the coffee settle properly over the low flame. "Don't say it," he said. "Low heat long time," she said anyway. "You are very pleased with yourself," he observed. "I am," she confirmed. He also, during those 5 snowbound days, attempted to cook for her again. He was very deliberate about this, which she found both touching and mildly alarming. He had been watching her for months, he said, and he thought he had a reasonable understanding of how to make soup, and soup was the obvious choice for a blizzard. She sat at the kitchen table with her mending and watched him assemble it, and she did not interfere, even when he put the carrots in at the beginning when they should have gone in at the end, even when he seasoned it with a hand that was considerably heavier on the salt than it needed to be. She watched him taste it and reconsider the salt and add more, which was the wrong direction to go in, and then taste it again and look at it with a slight frown. "How is it?" she asked. "It's not what I intended," he admitted. "Let me see," she said, and she came and tasted it, and it was too salty and the carrots were going mushy and it needed something green to balance it, but the base of it, the stock he'd made from the bones she'd been keeping, was genuinely good, and she told him so. "The stock is excellent," she said. "Everything else needs help." "Show me," he said, and he meant it, the way he meant everything he said, completely and without reservation. She showed him. She added more water to cut the salt, added dried herbs from the window, showed him how to taste it with a small amount on a clean spoon, neutralizing his palate first with a piece of plain bread, the way her grandmother had shown her. The soup became, over the next hour, genuinely good, and when they sat down to eat it by the fire with the blizzard pressing against the windows and the world reduced to this one warm room, she told him so. "You made a good soup," she said. He looked at his bowl with the expression of a man who has done something he wasn't entirely sure he could do. "It had considerable help," he said. "All good things do," she said. He looked at her and the lamp and the fire between them, and he said quietly, "I don't know what I was doing before you came here." "Surviving on salt pork and determination," she said. "Yes," he said, "but I mean the rest of it." She reached across the small table and put her hand on his wrist. "You were building something," she said. "You just needed someone to build it with." By February, Frances knew she was carrying their child, and she sat with the knowledge for a week before she told Simon, not because she was afraid to tell him, but because she wanted to be sure, and because she wanted 1 week of it being entirely her own private knowledge, the way some things are best understood alone first before they become shared. She told him on a Sunday morning, in the kitchen, over breakfast. She had made biscuits and gravy and real eggs, and he was eating with the appreciation he always brought to her cooking, and she set down her fork and looked at him across the table and said, "We're going to have a child." He went very still. Then he set his fork down with great care, as though he had become concerned about the structural integrity of the table, and he looked at her with an expression that was so open and unguarded that it made her throat tight. "Are you certain?" he said. "Yes," she said. He got up from the table and came around to her and dropped to one knee beside her chair, which she had not expected, and took both her hands in his. "Are you well?" he said. "How are you feeling? You should have told me sooner. You should have. I would have made sure you weren't working so hard, the garden and you should have said." "Simon," she said. He stopped. "I'm fine," she said. "I'm healthy and capable, and I'll tell you when I need anything." He was quiet for a moment, and then he put his forehead against their joined hands, and she felt the breath that went out of him, and she understood that it was not entirely about the child, that it was also about the life they had built, this specific life in this specific place, that it was about the fact that this was real and permanent and had its own future now. "I'm going to be a father," he said against her hands. "Yes," she said softly. He raised his head and looked at her, and his eyes were bright in a way she had not seen before, a brightness that had nothing careful or contained about it. "I'm going to be a terrible father," he said. "I can't cook. I can barely manage a civil conversation before my second cup of coffee." "You'll be a wonderful father," she said, "for the same reasons you're a good husband." "What reasons are those?" "You show up," she said. "You try. You don't give up on things because they're difficult. And you're capable of learning, even if it takes time." He kissed her hands, both of them, and then stood up and kissed her forehead, and she put her arms around him and held on. And outside the kitchen window the February sky was the pale, washed blue of a morning that was going to clear into something fine. The summer that followed was full and warm and busy in the way that summers on a working ranch always are, but it was also something else. Something that Frances had not quite expected, which was that it was the happiest she had ever been. She was large and uncomfortable by August, and her back hurt and the heat was appalling, but the happiness was underneath all of that, steady and certain, a thing that didn't depend on conditions. Simon hovered, which she found both touching and occasionally exasperating. He would appear at the kitchen door in the mornings to carry water for her, and then appear again in the afternoons to see whether she needed anything. And when she told him she was fine, and that a woman 8 months along was not made of paper, he would nod in the serious way he had, and then appear again an hour later with a cup of cold water or a question about whether the chair she was sitting in was comfortable. "The chair is fine," she said one afternoon, catching him in the act of assessing it from the doorway with the focused scrutiny of a man evaluating a structural defect. "The chair has been fine every time you've asked about it. I just want to be sure," he said. "Simon, Frances." "Come sit down," she said. "Stop standing in doorways watching me. Come and sit and talk to me, that's what I want." He came and sat across from her, and she put her mending aside and he talked. He told her about the plans he had for expanding the herd next spring, and about a letter he'd received from a land agent in Amarillo about a small adjacent parcel that was available, and about the fact that Deke had been seeing the Calloway daughter, Mora, who was a pleasant girl of 19 with a steady head and a good laugh, and that Ernesto had observed this development with the same serene commentary he applied to most situations. "What did Ernesto say?" Frances asked. "He said that Deke would do all right for himself if he stopped talking so much and started listening more," Simon said. "Ernesto is a wise man," Frances said. "He is," Simon agreed. "Have you told him that?" "He knows it," Simon said. "Tell him anyway," she said. "People like to hear it." He looked at her with the thoughtful expression that meant he was taking something on board, storing it somewhere useful, and she loved that about him, that he heard things she said and actually used them, that a conversation with him was not just sound going into a space but something that actually mattered. Their son was born in late September, on a Tuesday, with the help of Mrs. Calloway and the doctor from Hart Creek, who arrived with admirable speed. Simon stayed in the front room and was, by all reports from Mrs. Calloway, delivered afterward with gleeful detail, in a state of near-complete agitation for the 4 hours it took, wearing a path in the floorboards with his pacing, and drinking enough coffee to fuel a steam engine. When Mrs. Calloway came out and told him it was done and both of them were well and he could come in, he went through that door with the velocity of a man who has been kept from the most important thing in the world by a thin partition. And Frances, lying in the bed with her son in her arms, looked up at his face when he came in, and thought that she had never seen anything like it. This expression on Simon Sullivan that was completely stripped of every layer of containment, every habit of careful reserve. Entirely exposed and open and luminous. He came and sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and he held his son with the focused, reverent care of a man who understands the weight of something irreplaceable, and the baby, who had been squirming, went quiet in those large calloused hands as though he recognized the particular steadiness of them. "He's perfect," Simon said very quietly. "He is," Frances agreed, her voice rough and warm. "What shall we call him?" he asked. She had been thinking about this. "James," she said. "James Sullivan, for your father." He looked at her, and the thing that moved across his face was large and complicated, and he didn't try to manage it. "Thank you," he said. "Your father built something too," she said. "Even if the land didn't cooperate, the wanting was the same." He looked down at the baby, at James, and he said softly, "You're going to have better ground than he did," talking to his son, talking to the future. "I'll make sure of it." Frances reached out and put her hand on his arm, and the three of them stayed like that in the September afternoon, the light coming gold through the curtains, the ranch outside going on in its daily work, the world outside going on in its particular complicated way, and inside that room there was a completeness that had its own weight and warmth. James Sullivan was a vigorous, opinionated child who from the beginning made his preferences known with great clarity and impressive volume. He slept in long, satisfied stretches after nursing, and then woke with the sudden conviction that he had been abandoned and was very unhappy about it. And this cycle repeated itself with metronomic regularity throughout the night. Simon, who had never had any particular difficulty with hard work and no sleep, got up as a matter of course in the nights to bring the baby to Frances, and also to sit with him in the kitchen when he was done feeding and was still wakeful, rocking in the old rocking chair that had appeared 1 week after the baby's birth, brought from Amarillo by wagon in what Simon described simply as a necessary acquisition. Frances would wake in the gray before dawn sometimes and go to the kitchen and find them there, Simon in the rocking chair with James settled on his chest, both of them quiet, the baby's eyes open and unfocused in the lamplight, Simon's eyes down on the baby's face with the expression she had come to think of as his looking at James' face, which was different from every other expression she knew on him, stripped down to something essential and tender, and entirely without self-consciousness. She would make coffee and hand him a cup and lean against the doorframe and watch them, and she thought that she had never imagined, when she had read that spare, practical advertisement in the newspaper in Amarillo, that this was where it would go, that a job as a housekeeper would bring her here, to this particular man in this particular kitchen at 4 in the morning with this particular baby between them, and that here would turn out to be exactly where she had always been heading. Spring came around again, the second spring, and the ranch expanded. Simon bought the adjacent parcel from the Amarillo land agent, which added good pasture land on the north side of the property, and he hired 2 additional ranch hands to manage the larger operation. Deke and Maura Calloway were married in March, which made Frances cry in the church and made Deke grin so widely that his face appeared to be in some structural danger, and which made Ernesto nod with the satisfaction of a man whose predictions have been vindicated. Ernesto himself, it turned out, had a history that was longer and more complicated than he had shared in the ordinary course of working days. He had been born in New Mexico Territory, had worked the cattle trails for 20 years, had a daughter in Santa Fe whom he saw twice a year and who was, he said simply, the best person he knew. He had come north with Simon 4 years ago because Simon offered him fair wages and treated him with respect, which was not as common as it ought to have been, and he had stayed because the ranch was a good place, and because Simon Sullivan was one of the few employers he had worked for who saw him as a person rather than a pair of capable hands, a fact that Frances, learning it, felt acutely in the context of the injustices that followed men like Ernesto across the West. The way that the same country that was built in large part by the labor of men who looked like him often managed to look right through them. She told Simon this one evening. "I know it," he said. "He's worth more than most men I've ever met, and you're right that it's a particular kind of wrong the way things are set up." "Does he know you think so?" she asked. "I've tried to show it," Simon said. "The wages, the respect, treating him the same as any other man." "Tell him," she said again as she'd said once before. "Don't just show it, tell him." Simon was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded in the way he had, the way that meant he was actually going to do it. And she knew from the way Ernesto came in to supper 2 days later with a lightness about him that he hadn't had before that Simon had, in fact, done it, had said the words, had given the man the explicit dignity of being told his worth out loud. Frances loved him for that. By the time James was 2, Frances was expecting again, and this time it felt different, more settled, the worry less sharp because she had done it before, and because Simon had done it before, and because they both knew something now about what they were capable of. The pregnancy was easier, which she was grateful for, and she moved through the spring and summer of 1881 with the particular contentment of a woman who is in the right place in her life. She was in the kitchen on a warm July evening, making supper while James tottered around the kitchen floor, investigating everything within his reach with the systematic thoroughness of a very small, very serious scientist. When Simon came in from the day's work and stopped in the doorway and simply looked at the scene in front of him for a moment, the way he sometimes did, storing it, she thought, the way he stored good things, carefully and in a place where they would keep. She looked up from the stove and saw him watching her. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "I was just looking." "You're going to make me burn the supper," she said, He came and picked up James, who made a sound of delight and immediately attempted to remove Simon's hat, and Simon held him on one arm and came to stand beside Frances at the stove and looked into the pot. "What is that?" he asked. "Chicken stew," she said, "with dumplings." "The dumplings aren't burned," he observed. "No," she agreed. "Because I made them." He laughed quietly, and James laughed because Simon laughed, and Frances stirred the pot and felt the warmth of her family around her in the kitchen, and thought that there was not much better than this in any world she could imagine. "I tried," Simon said reflectively. "You did," she agreed. "I've gotten better at the coffee," he said. "You have," she acknowledged. "The coffee is reliably good now." "I made a passable soup last November," he said. "It was good," she corrected. "Not passable, good." "You helped with the seasoning." "You made the stock," she said firmly, "and the stock was excellent." He was quiet for a moment, and she could feel him smiling even though she was looking at the pot. "I can also make hardtack," he said. "Nobody wants hardtack," she said. "I know," he agreed cheerfully, "but I can make it." She looked at him then sideways. This man with his son on his arm in the warm kitchen, with dust on his boots and a day's work behind him, laughing at himself with the easy comfort of a man who is secure enough in who he is to be honest about what he isn't. And she thought that this was the most herself she had ever been. This life, this kitchen, this man. And that she would not have arrived here if she hadn't walked through that door a year earlier into a cloud of burned beans and found someone trying. Their daughter was born in October of 1881, and they named her Clara, after Frances's grandmother, the woman who had taught her everything worth knowing about a kitchen and about patience, and about the way love is expressed through the things we make with our hands for the people we love. Clara was quieter than James had been, a watchful baby who looked around her from the first days with the steady, curious eyes of someone taking inventory. And Simon said she reminded him of her mother, which Frances took as the high compliment it was intended to be. James, at 2 years old, was very interested in his sister, and also somewhat uncertain about the reorganization of attention her arrival represented. And he dealt with this by becoming Simon's shadow in the mornings, following him through the yard and the barn and the pasture with the determined toddling gait of someone who intended to go wherever the important things were happening. Simon, who had once said he would be a terrible father and had been comprehensively wrong about this, took James with him on morning rounds as a matter of course, putting him on the saddle in front of him, talking to him about the cattle and the fences, and the land the way some men talk to their horses, with quiet, companionable attention. Frances watched this from the porch sometimes, and thought about what her grandmother had told her once, that you can learn more about a man from watching him with children and animals than from anything he tells you about himself, and that Simon Sullivan, who had never cooked a meal worth eating in his life, who had burned beans and biscuits and salt pork and something that had apparently once been cornbread, was one of the finest men she had ever had the opportunity to know. She told him this on a November evening when both children were asleep and the house was quiet, and they were sitting by the fire with the first cold of the season pressing at the windows. He looked at her with the expression she loved best, the open, unguarded one, the storm after the storm expression. "You've made me better," he said. "No," she said. "You were already this. I just gave you something to show it for." He reached over and took her hand, and they sat by the fire in the house they had built together. The house that smelled of baking bread and wood smoke and horses and children. The house that was at the center of a working ranch on the Texas Panhandle in the year 1881, in a country that was still becoming itself, still figuring out what it was and who it would be, full of injustice and beauty and hard work and occasional grace. "I'm going to try making biscuits again this week," he announced. She closed her eyes briefly. "Why?" she said. "Because I think I'm close," he said, "to a successful biscuit, to a biscuit that would not embarrass either of us," he said. She opened her eyes and looked at him, and she saw the deliberate humor in his, the self-aware comedy of a man who knows exactly what he is doing, which is making her laugh, which is one of the things he had learned in 3 years that he was particularly good at. She laughed. He watched her laugh with the same expression he always had when he'd accomplished this, a private satisfaction, a warmth that was not showing off but was simply the pleasure of having done the thing he was going for. "All right," she said. "Make your biscuits, I'll be nearby." "To rescue them," he said. "To rescue them," she confirmed. He squeezed her hand, and the fire crackled, and outside the Texas wind moved across the land that was theirs, and upstairs 2 children slept in the good honest darkness, and everything that had begun with a cloud of burned beans and a woman walking through a door had arrived here, at this particular evening in this particular life. The years that followed had the quality of a good life, which is to say they were not without difficulty, not without the ordinary trials of weather and economy and the 1,000 small negotiations that any life requires, but they were threaded through with something steady and warm that held everything together when the difficult parts came. In the spring of 1883, a drought worse than any since Frances had arrived took hold of the region, and the creek dropped to nothing for 2 months, and the pasture dried to a pale gold, and the cattle lost condition despite everything they could do. Simon worked from before sunrise until after dark every day for 6 weeks, and came home in the evenings hollowed out with exhaustion, and Frances made sure there was hot food and clean water and a lamp burning, and they sat together at the supper table and talked about what needed doing and what could be managed and what simply had to be waited out, and the talking helped, the way it always did, and the season turned, as seasons do, and the creek came back and the grass came back and the cattle recovered. In the summer of 1884, Deke and Maura had their first child, a boy named Thomas, and Deke appeared in the kitchen doorway the morning after the birth with a face that looked like the sun had taken up residence inside him and couldn't quite be contained, and Simon shook his hand and Frances put her arms around him and said, "Well done," and meant both the having of the baby and the having become the kind of man who deserved one. Ernesto's daughter came to visit from Santa Fe that same summer, a young woman named Lucia who had her father's quietness and her own considerable intelligence, and who sat at Frances's kitchen table and talked with her about the territory, and about the changes coming and about what it meant to be a woman making her way in this particular time and place. And Frances thought she was one of the most interesting people she had met in years, and said so to Ernesto. And Ernesto looked pleased in the particular way of a parent who has been told a good true thing about their child. In the fall of 1884, Frances looked around her kitchen on a Sunday morning with James, now 5, at the table drawing pictures of horses with the wrong number of legs, and Clara, 3, on the rug with her rag doll, and Simon at the stove making coffee with the competence he had slowly, determinedly acquired, and she felt the fullness of the moment with a clarity that was almost startling, the way certain moments announce themselves as the kind you will carry forward. James looked up from his horse drawing and said, with the directness of a 5-year-old, "Papa, why can't you make biscuits?" Simon looked down from the coffee pot at his son. "I can make biscuits," he said. James considered this with the skepticism of a child who has eaten the results. "They are not very good biscuits," he said. "James," Frances said, keeping her face very still. "They are work in progress," Simon said with the gravity of a man accepting a fair assessment. "Mama's biscuits are better," James said. "Yes," Simon agreed. "They are significantly better." "Why?" James asked. "Because your mother is significantly better at it," Simon said. "Can she teach you?" James asked. "She's been trying for 5 years," Simon said. James seemed to find this worth thinking about. Then he said, with a 5-year-old's decisive logic, "Maybe you should just not make biscuits." "That is," Simon said, glancing at Frances, who had given up trying to keep her face still, "very probably the most sensible thing anyone has ever said to me." Frances laughed, and Clara laughed because her mother was laughing, and even James looked pleased that he had said something successful, and Simon poured the coffee with the dignified composure of a man who has made peace with certain truths about himself, and the Sunday morning settled around them all like something that knew exactly where it belonged. The biscuits, for the record, never quite reached the standard of Frances's. They reached what Simon called a functional level, meaning they were baked through and mostly the right shape and not inedible, which he was prepared to accept as a reasonable outcome. He made them occasionally, on Sunday mornings when Frances was busy with the children, and he served them with complete confidence, and the family ate them because they were there, and Simon had made them, and those two facts together gave them a value that had nothing to do with how they compared to the standard. Frances ate his biscuits and said they were good, because they were better than they used to be, and she meant it, and Simon looked at her with the look that said he knew she was being generous, and that he appreciated it, and that he was not going to make a fuss about the truth of it because this was how two people got along in a life, through the particular kindness of seeing each other clearly and still choosing to say the good thing. By 1886, the ranch was a genuinely thriving operation. The herd had grown considerably since the early days, the expanded pasture land was producing well, and Simon had the reputation in the county of a man who ran his operation fairly and worked as hard as anyone who worked for him, which was the kind of reputation that built something lasting. James, at 7, was beginning to be useful in the ways that ranch boys begin to be useful, carrying water and feeding the chickens and learning to ride properly, sitting high on his pony with the focused seriousness of a child who is doing something that matters. Clara, at 5, was increasingly demonstrating the particular quality of attention that her mother had and that had been noted from her first weeks, the ability to watch and listen, and then, when she was ready, to say something that was surprisingly direct and true. Frances kept the kitchen garden, expanded now to supply more than just the household, trading surplus vegetables and eggs and preserves with people in Hart Creek and with the Calloway family, and with Mrs. Hernandez at the store, who sold them on and gave Frances a fair share of what they brought in. It was not a large enterprise, but it was hers, built from nothing, the same way the rest of everything had been built. She thought about this sometimes, about the economy of small things, about the way that a kitchen garden and a jar of preserves and a good biscuit that makes someone feel cared for were not small things in the way the world sometimes categorized them as small. She thought about her grandmother, who had never done anything that the world counted as important, and who had left behind in the people she fed and taught a particular quality of steadiness, a knowledge that good things could be made from simple materials by steady hands. Frances thought she was carrying that forward, in this particular kitchen, in this particular landscape, in this particular life, and that the carrying forward was itself a kind of importance. Simon came in from a long day in late October of 1886 and found the kitchen full of the smell of apple pie, because Frances had traded with a woman passing through who had an excess of apples for some of her preserves, and there was something about the smell of apple pie in a warm kitchen on a cool autumn evening that stopped him in the doorway the same way it had stopped him at the beginning, that first evening, with a smoking pot and a woman rolling up her sleeves. He stood in the doorway and looked at her and the kitchen and the pie cooling on the sill, and he said, "This is the best place I have ever been in my life." She looked up at him, this man she had been married to for 8 years, this man she had learned and continued to learn, this man who tried things he was bad at with a sincerity that she would never stop finding endearing, and she said, "Come in and sit down." He came in and sat down, and she put a piece of pie in front of him, and he ate it with his eyes closed for the first bite the way he had always eaten things she made for him, with the attention of a man who understood that something made with skill and care deserved a proper response. "Do you remember the first night?" she asked. He opened his eyes. "The burned beans. The burned beans," she confirmed. "I think about it sometimes," he said. "What do you think about it?" He was quiet for a moment, considering it the way he always considered things that mattered. I think about the fact that you walked in and saw the worst of what I was capable of in terms of domestic management, and you laughed at it, and then you fixed it, and you didn't hold it against me. It was funny, she said. It was a lot of things, he said. But what I remember most is that you laughed like it was safe to laugh. Like it was all right that it had gone wrong because something better was coming. She thought about this. I didn't know that then, she said. No, he said. But it's what the laugh felt like. She reached across the table and put her hand on his, and his large calloused fingers closed around hers with the ease of long practice. Simon, she said. Frances, he said. I love you, she said. Still more. Still, he said. More. He looked at her with his storm-cleared eyes. I could attempt to make supper tomorrow night. You could, she said carefully. As a gesture, he said. What kind of gesture, she asked. The kind that says I know you've been feeding us all for 8 years and I'd like to try to give you a night off, he said. She looked at him. She thought about the beans. She thought about the biscuits. She thought about the birthday cornbread and the blizzard soup and the Sunday eggs that were brown at the edges. What would you make? She asked. Soup, he said. I can make a good soup now. You can, she agreed. This was true, and bread, he said, bread is essentially uncomplicated. Bread is not uncomplicated, she said. I'll attempt it, he said. You can supervise. I was going to anyway, she said. He smiled at her, the full real smile, and she smiled back. And the kitchen held them both in its warm lamplight. And outside the October dark was full of stars. And the ranch settled into the evening around them. All the things they had built. The house and the herd and the garden and the family and the daily life of two people who had found each other in the specific way that people find each other when they are paying enough attention to recognize the right thing when it appears. The bread the next night was dense and took too long in the oven and came out with a crust that required a good knife. But the inside was soft and the taste was right. And Frances ate 2 slices with butter and told him it was good bread, and it was. James ate his piece and nodded with the serious assessment of a 7-year-old. It's good bread, Papa, he said. Clara ate her piece and said nothing, but asked for more, which was in Frances's estimation the most honest possible review. Simon looked around the supper table at his family, his wife and his son and his daughter in the lamplight of the kitchen, and the expression on his face was the one Frances had first seen on the night she told him about the baby, the one that was entirely without containment, the one that was simply the truth of a man who knows he has more than he ever expected and is grateful for every particular part of it. The rest of the night passed as good nights do, without drama and without incident, and with the ordinary pleasures of a family in a warm house, with enough of what they needed and more than enough of what mattered. James fell asleep over his book, which he had recently decided he could read by himself, which was technically true in the way that most things a 7-year-old declares about their capabilities are technically true. Clara fell asleep on the rug with her rag doll in a state of complete abandonment, the way small children sleep when they feel entirely safe. Simon carried them both upstairs, one at a time, with the careful gentleness he brought to everything that could be hurt. And Frances turned down the lamps and banked the fire and stood for a moment in the quiet kitchen. She looked at the stove, and the breadboard where Simon's dense, good bread had been made, and the pie tin still on the sill, and the dried herbs along the window, and the small everyday accumulation of a life built in this room. She thought about the woman she had been when she came here, careful and contained and carrying a bruised heart and a basket of preserves, and absolutely no idea what was coming. She thought about the burned beans and the smoke, and the man with the wooden spoon who didn't know what baking powder was. She thought about a laugh that had come out of her before she could stop it in a smoky kitchen in the spring of 1878, and the way that laugh had opened something between two people that had grown into everything she was now standing inside of. Simon came back downstairs and found her standing in the kitchen. "You all right?" he said. "I was thinking," she said. "About what?" "About how I got here," she said. He came and stood beside her and looked out the window at the dark ranch. "You took a stage from Amarillo," he said. "Before that," she said, You wrote a letter, he said. Before that, he considered. You read an advertisement in a newspaper, he said. And before that I was in the wrong place feeling like the wrong person, she said. And then I read about a ranch in Hart Creek that needed a housekeeper who could cook and had the constitution for hard work, and something in me said yes. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood at the kitchen window looking out at the land and the stars. I'm glad you said yes, he said. So am I, she said. I'm glad you laughed at the beans, he said. They were very funny beans, she said. They were a disaster, he agreed. Most of my cooking was a disaster. Most of it still is, she said fondly. The soup is good, he maintained. The soup is good, she confirmed. And the bread was acceptable. The bread was good, she said. It was really good. He held her a little tighter, and she put her arm around his waist. And the kitchen was warm, and the house was quiet, and the children slept upstairs, and the ranch breathed around them in the October night. And nothing was unresolved. Nothing was left open and uncertain. Everything that needed to be built was built, and everything that needed to be said had been said. And the life they had between them was solid and warm and real and entirely, completely theirs. Outside, the Texas sky was full of stars, the same sky that had been here before any of them and would be here long after, indifferent and magnificent. And below it the land stretched in every direction. And on that land was a working ranch in Hart Creek. And in the ranch house, a man and a woman stood together in a warm kitchen that smelled of good bread and apple pie and years of meals made with skill and care and love. And there was nothing more that needed to happen, because everything had already perfectly arrived.